Welcome, listeners, to www.ironradio.org, the website and podcast for all things strength sports and sports nutrition. With your hosts, Lonnie Lowery.
Remember, Phil is like a gnarled old oak tree held together with scar tissue and bone spurs.
Rob Fortney.
And I'm telling you, the pain that I would suffer was beyond excruciating.
And Phil Stevens.
Do it, Rob. You'll kill all those nerves.
Thanks for listening.
Welcome, Iron Radio listeners. This is Lonnie Lowery. I'm an exercise physiology and nutrition professor of about 20 years, and I'm a former competitive bodybuilder.
Hey, this is Phil Stevens, powerlifter, Highland Games athlete, strength coach at Strengthfield.
Hey, it's Dr. Mike Nelson. I'm a faculty member at the Carrick Institute, do a bunch of other stuff, and I'm down here in Florida, actually, just going through the Carrick Institute Human Performance Program right now.
And this is Rick Alexander. I appreciate you guys having me on. I'm an author, speaker, and adventure athlete of sorts.
Cool. Awesome. And today's topic is called Comfort Doesn't Equal Happiness. And for people who may not be familiar with you, Rick, can you give us kind of your background and origin story?
Yeah, sure. So I think I was probably like a lot of people that sort of were trying to figure it out in high school. I mean, there's a lot of paths a lot of different paths that you could possibly take when you're growing up trying to figure it out. And I happened to be lucky enough that the first thing that I got addicted to were sports. And so I look back at a lot of people that took different paths in life, especially as all the temptations you have in high school. And I think it really was luck. My parents got me in sports at such an early age, and it took up such a big part of my identity that there wasn't necessarily a lot left as I grew up. And then went to college again, was kind of still looking for direction. And then I found the military. I found a special forces program and decided to try my hand at that. And then turns out that physical prowess does have somewhere to go when you're an adult in the military. So kind of I took that path for a while. And then through that path, I started businesses, and I started competing in strength sports. I started competing in endurance sports, just a lot of trying to figure it out over the last 10 years. And I'm sure we'll get to why I chose the topic I chose. But essentially, as I look back at my entire career, it was the one constant when it came to success in high school, success in the military, success in the entrepreneurship world. It was kept having these moments where I would look around and I was everybody around me, so many people around me, they mistake this idea of being comfortable with being happy. And what I was starting to find especially through the military, is that they weren't necessarily always related like everybody thought they were. And so it's a perfect topic for my origin story, because that's definitely, the way that I came about as I grew up.
Very cool. Can you give some examples of what kind of strength sports and some of the other sports you've done? Because I know you've done just a wide variety of all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I played college and high school, and I played I played lacrosse in high school, and I played for a year in college. And then moving on, I again joined the military, and then kind of got into the endurance scene in the military, just because when you're going through a special forces selection, that's really what they're looking for. A lot of people think that they need to get a big bench press, but you realize your 500-pound deadlift does very little for you on a soft sand run on the beach. So I got into endurance sports through that. And then as I got to the team, started deploying, doing different things like that. And then I got into strongman, got into powerlifting, got into CrossFit for a while. Felt like I was just punishing myself all the time with CrossFit, and wasn't as much enjoyment as the strength sports. At least that's what I found. And then I signed up for a 100-mile endurance race. So I did that, and I kind of got hooked. Which we could get into if you guys want. But yeah, so lately my sport of choice has definitely been the ultra endurance stuff. I just finished last week. I did a 247-mile run while wearing body armor to raise money for Gold Star families, which are families who have lost somebody in the war.
Wow. How do you get to go from, very on the end of strength sports, strongman, things like that, to doing 200+ mile race while wearing heavy stuff?
Yeah, you know what it is, and I can feel myself swinging back right now, and I think it's at some point when you sense inability in yourself, like anybody that's an athlete, I think can probably relate to this. At some point when I'd get really heavy into the strength sports, especially when I was competing in strongman and dabbling in that area, and then I would realize like I would get winded when I ran up the stairs or needed to tie my shoes. And then that would bug me, and I would feel like I needed to get uncomfortable in a different area. And so then I would find myself pursuing something else that would get me, sort of way outside of my comfort zone. And then through the last couple of years of doing the ultra endurance stuff, I've even started to notice like, oh man, it's like going into the gym, it's bugging me how far below my 1 rep maxes I've been. And so it's like I can feel that I'm starting to like wanting to pick that scab now, because I'm like, oh God, this is how you never become great at stuff. You just swing back and forth. But I just really love the process of doing something that feels very foreign, I guess, and just learning new things as well.
Yeah. What are some of the lessons that you've learned from that kind of carry over across, because most people listening in are obviously more on the strength side, but I think there's a lot of lessons that are similar across sports. I mean, we kind of look at them and we're like, oh, those crazy nut jobs doing 100-mile races, and you kind of think that there's not anything in common, but I'm guessing from your experience there's probably quite a bit more in common.
Yeah, and I think that's like the number one thing I've taken away from all of these different experiences is like there's so many lessons that you could learn from athletes that are not necessarily in your camp. And it kind of bums me out a little bit because we tend to like live in silos. And so if we're powerlifters, we tend to only listen to the powerlifting crowd. When it turns out, in my opinion, that there's a lot of things you could probably gain from other coaches. If we're talking about powerlifting specifically, when it talk about aerobic capacity, I've learned like, that was something I was always like, 5 reps or more is my cardio. I was definitely that guy for a while. But then I realized if you build your aerobic capacity, you can increase intensity as you go further into your sets and reps. And so why would you not want at least that ability? And it's not that I'm not saying everybody in that crowd is that way, but same thing on the running crowd. It was like I looked at something like creatine, strength, endurance, recovery, all these benefits. One of the most studied supplement we have, and it's like you bring creatine to runners and they avoid it like the plague. And it's like there's a lot you could get from this. And so I think just learning those crossover lessons has been really beneficial. And so I think I would encourage anybody that I would say isn't just really focused on one thing. Like if you are trying to figure it out, there's a lot of lessons you can learn from dabbling in sports that are outside of your own, even if it's in the off season or even if it's attending a seminar and just listening to what somebody else might have to say.
Rick, if I can interject. So I'm curious about something. I mean, I hear what you're saying about not living in an echo chamber and that kind of thing for sure. But I remember Fortress, who started the show with us, when he did a lot of, aerobic-based types of training, he felt like he was swinging even further from one side of the spectrum to the other because he was that guy, that 5-rep guy. As you've done this, do you think that your transitioning has actually been a longer journey than had you just started as a sedentary dude?
I'm not sure I understand the question completely.
Okay, so if somebody's sedentary, they're like 50-50 fast and slow twitch fibers, they have minimal strength, minimal aerobic base, minimal everything. And if you ask them to do an aerobic work, endurance work, Rob was suggesting that they actually had an easier time because they weren't starting at 300 pounds of body weight, right? They weren't specialized. And it sounds like you were pretty specialized on the strength. So I'm curious about, as you moved toward the endurance end of the spectrum, did that feel like a longer journey than had you just started, with endurance?
Yeah, I would agree completely with him. And I'm sure you guys can speak to the adaptation of different muscle fibers as you become very specialized. I mean, it seems like there's a lot of research coming out that says you can really convert a lot of what you have to what you're doing at the time. And so I would agree with you completely. Like it took me a really, really long time to, even because I spent so much time gaining weight. So like, it seemed like homeostasis for my body was so much heavier, that even, amidst all of the running and all of the higher rep stuff I started doing, my body just did not want to adapt to that lower stuff. And even now I'm 2 years into the endurance stuff, but I spent the rest of my life kind of, like most kids, just wanting to get bigger and stronger. And so now, like, when I look at it, I'm like much smaller, but I'm still way bigger than every endurance athlete at the starting line, And as soon as I stop as soon as I start lifting, my body it springs right back to where it was. So, I would definitely agree. I think it takes a lot longer because you've spent so much time telling your body to go in this one direction.
Yeah, no, that's good. So we'll take a slight break and then we'll get into the topic of the day here and expand a little bit more on that and some of the training stuff, and also talk a little bit about why comfort doesn't equal happiness.
Perfect.
Hey listeners, this is Dr. Lonnie Lowry. If you've ever had anyone critique you on your protein intake as part of your weightlifting lifestyle, oh, you poor meathead, all that extra protein is going to rot your kidneys or weaken your bones or dehydrate you or give you gout or who knows what. There is a book available. You could simply Google CRC Press and Lowry. And what I've done is reach out to experts all over the world and create a book, a single compendium that you can hold up and say, this is why I consume extra protein. This can be very valuable when you're being quote-unquote educated by various professionals on the topic. There's an enormous amount of literature in this book on the safety, the effectiveness, how protein works in cells, the history of protein and weight trainers, much more. So again, please check out CRC Press and Protein and Lowry. You can just Google that, and full disclosure, I do make a small single-digit royalty on the book, but that's not why I did it. I did it so we can all have something, our particular population, to both defend what we do and to inform our nutrition and our eating. Thanks. Iron Radio is, of course, primarily a podcast. But over the years, there have been technical glitches calling for backup streaming and listeners who wanted the convenience of other sources of audio content. Toward this end, Iron Radio is now simulcast and backed up on YouTube. If needed, please search Lawnman07 or Iron Radio from within YouTube. There's not much video, but if you like to listen through YouTube on a Roku or other living room device, there you go.
Like your weekly fix of Iron Radio? In addition to being a popular institute on iTunes, we are also on email. Simply go to www.ironradio.org and sign up for the voluntary email. You'll get a once per week email, no more. That's little more than the show notes and a link to the audio. So go for it.
So we're back on Iron Radio here. It's Dr. Mike T. Nelson, Dr. Lonnie Lowry, Coach Phil Stevens, and Rick Alexander is our guest here today, talking about why comfort doesn't equal happiness. And right before the break, we were talking about some of the different training adaptations. And do you think that kind of the topic we're discussing, part of that is because you were kind of a heavier runner? I always think it's interesting, right? I did a novice strongman thing several years ago, just, very much a local event. And to keep it simple, they only had lightweight and heavyweight. So if you were under 220, you were a lightweight. If you were over 220, you were a heavyweight. Mm-hmm. And for like kiteboarding and stuff, like I weigh like 230. It's like, wow, that's a big dude. But for strongman, it's like, oh, that's a tiny guy.
Yeah.
I think it also, do you find that by being probably a little bit bigger, that endurance was a little bit harder, especially being compared to other people you were racing against?
Oh, without a doubt. Yeah, absolutely. I think there were some advantages, or are some advantages, I think, because, posterior chain is so developed. When you get deep into races, there's a lot that there's a lot you can gain just because I think people tend to burn out, and it really does turn into more muscular endurance and much less, I would say, like cardiovascular endurance when you get deep into these races, because you can only move so fast for 200 miles. And so, yeah, there are definitely some advantages, but by and large, it's an uphill battle for sure. So when I did, again, just stressing, I was doing very novice strongman as well, but 230, I believe it's 232 was lightweight. And so I was sticking around 230 pounds. So the first 100 miler I ran, I actually weighed 225.
Oh, jeez.
Which is way bigger than everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And talking about comfort doesn't equal happiness, do you do specific things to kind of make yourself uncomfortable? Like what springs to my mind, especially for, lifters, is different breathing techniques are real popular now, cold water immersion. There seems to be kind of more of a trend again back, and maybe it's because we live in just such, air conditioned, everything is all kind of the same homeostatic thing all the time, of purposely injecting some types of physiologic variability and extremes into our life. And then are there any examples maybe for listeners that you'd recommend a starting point?
Yeah, I mean, I think cold water immersion is, which you mentioned, I think that is undoubtedly one of the best, because, if you take an evolutionary biology perspective, like when you're looking at, the development of the human being, which tends to be how I look at everything. It's like I think athletes get it to a certain degree. It's like, because it doesn't make sense to go torture yourself in any other way, right? Like from a reasonable perspective, why are people out in the mud running around? Why did CrossFit blow up in the last 20 years? Strength sports has blown up. I think the only logical explanation is because there's some part of our fabric that was sort of born and bred of the wild, and now we need that to still feel whole. And so I think athletes inherently get that. The problem with being an athlete is you can get really uncomfortable, or you can get really comfortable with uncomfortable situations, right? Because you sort of level up, and your new normal sort of resets. And so then you're looking for, I think you always have to be looking for that new frontier to sort of push into if you want to continue to gain those benefits, which, that's how we grow as humans anyway. So back to your original point, I think if you dunk your entire body in ice water, you will get very uncomfortable really fast. And then that's cool too, because then you can really worry about trying to control that physiological state with your breathing and with different techniques. And so you can get pretty comfortable even with that discomfort. I hit the ice bath almost every day. So
very cool. Do you do stuff with your lifters, Phil, to make them kind of uncomfortable at times? Obviously you're going to do some simulation practice and maybe more testing days perhaps, but do you think of that more just from a physiologic response, or are you trying to make them uncomfortable on purpose at particular times?
Yeah, most of my choices as far as uncomfortable will be making them do things they suck at.
Yeah.
So if somebody's really bad at something, it means we're going to do it more, and they usually don't like that, but then they end up getting okay at it, which helps them in the long run. So, and my powerlifters and things, once what we call on season is over, so peaking for a meet, then usually it's okay, time to get some conditioning on and things like that. And it sucks for a little bit, but it helps them out in the long run. So.
Yeah. Do you think, Lonnie, there's an argument for even hormetic responses? There's some new stuff on maybe ginger and turmeric and things like that, where you're purposely ingesting compounds that your body, quote unquote, kind of doesn't like, but then you get better because of that?
Yeah, I think if there's one thing that both nutrition and exercise physiology tell us, right, is that the human body it's the adaptability, right? Think about all these other fields, medicine and physical therapy and other things, strength conditioning, they all bank on this idea that if you're exposed, whether it's a mild immunological stress, resistance training, cardiovascular kinds of stressors, hormonal things, that there's going to be some homeostatic response, some attempt to maintain balance, so you're going to grow in that direction. If that's what you mean, right? So I think the whole field is sort of based on that concept, and it may be something, maybe to the point of the conversation, that the general population has sort of lost. Like Sagan would say, the sedentary life where instead of chasing animals, we put them in a pen, or we grow the food instead of foraging for it, and all that kind of stuff. That sedentary life has left us fat and edgy in a lot of ways, so we just don't have any of those challenges. I like what you said about being indoors, and you think about all the problems with, lung cancer is the most prevalent cancer. We lay on styrene carpet,
Yeah.
We're always comfortable. I grew up, we didn't have AC in my house. So there was a thermal stressor, and I don't feel that now, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of that in terms of just physiologic flexibility, right? How many things can you change, whether that's the amount of fat or carbohydrates in your diet or fasting or temperature or even like that. Like so far in my garage gym, I don't have a fan in the summer. And granted, it does get pretty warm in Minnesota, but not like other places. And part of that is I'm wondering if maybe being more acclimated to heat stress for particular seasons of the year and then more acclimated to cold stress, maybe that's a benefit over time since I don't have much exposure to those things. Mm-hmm. And a lot of other people are even more, temperature neutral than I am too. So.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think one thing that Lonnie just brought up was, everybody thinks about the fact that we used to chase and kill our own animals, of course, right? And one of the stark sort of realizations that I had was, Amazon Prime. We can this thing that used to be a life or death situation, literally can be done with just a button from your couch at this point. And I just think that we don't necessarily know the implications of that. Like that's pretty stark if you just look at it. And I think that we've only had technology for such a short time. Like our biology certainly has not caught up. We don't know what that looks like as we kind of project it out.
I think one thing we know looks like, yesterday I was watching an old 70s flick, old Spielberg flick, and I looked at my wife and I said, there was a big crowd scene. I said, no one on that screen is obese, right? No one was obese. And now if they showed a similar sized crowd, half of them would be obese, right? So I think there are these visual things that we just willfully disregard, maybe, because clearly something is going wrong. So anyway.
Yeah, but I think that's actually how we're wired survivally based, right? We're wired for efficiency. If you can, my buddy Dr. Ben House has said this too, like if you can go to McDonald's and get a Big Mac for, I don't even know what they are, $1.39 or whatever, and get 600, 700, 800 calories for like the lowest amount of money, that's kind of what we're wired for, So it makes sense that people are going to move that direction, and we probably cognitively have to do things to stop moving in that direction all the time and to kind of counteract it too.
Yeah, so I agree completely. It's like, that's kind of one of the points I brought up in my book is, survival itself used to lend itself to meaning. And so, that's what we were striving for so long. We didn't have survival on lock like we do now. And so it didn't make sense to go out looking for extra work, right? For millions of years, it would make no sense to leave and just go pick things up for the hell of it because your life was about trying to survive. But now we're in this sort of weird era where we have to kind of neglect what got us here in order to feel good going forward. I mean, and I think you're right, like obesity, depression rates, I mean, nothing is going down at this point. And so I think we gotta like look at why, but then also if you step back, it's kind of cool because now we're at a point where we get to like choose our own evolution going forward. Whether it's strength, whether it's endurance, we've never had that luxury for millions of years. And so I think you're right. You have to like sort of step away from all of the efficiencies that we're wired for. And then entrepreneurship is meant to offer the next solution, but as consumers, I think you just have to use a little bit of tact as you select what you consume.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit more about the race you did. You said, was it 247 miles? You said wearing full body armor?
I did, yeah. So I just got out of the military, and I wanted to sort of do an ode to my service and then also just kind of use the platform to raise money for something I cared about. And I felt pretty lucky that I'm getting out after, 10 years without pretty much all of my definitely all my arms and legs, pretty much my sanity. And so I just felt like I should give back in some way. I have a lot of friends that weren't so lucky and left families behind. And so I just thought about, what can I do to give back to that? And that was sort of the experience that I landed on. You know, it's like everybody has a wheelhouse. For me, it's like putting it in second gear, and suffering is definitely my wheelhouse. And so I knew I could get a lot of attention and money for that cause. So that's what I did.
Yeah. You know, Rick, let me ask you this. So I had a conversation just yesterday, and because of your military background, you mentioned we have a luxury of developing in very specific directions, right? It's not like you've got to have be 75% capable with aerobic base, with strength, with flexibility, or all these different things. We can actually specialize. And we had a discussion, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, about if you were on a special forces team and dropped in a random part of the world, would you rather be on a team of, jacks of all trades, everybody at that 75% percentile sort of thing as far as the components of fitness, or would you rather be on a team of specialists? You've got the really strong guy, you've got the real fleet of foot endurance guy. What would be your preference for that?
It's kind of funny because if you dissect all of the different special forces groups, there are groups that, like I would say Army Special Forces, from what I've seen, they're more focused. They have more focused people on their teams with different jobs. And then in the Navy, we tend to cross-train a lot and do everybody's job. And so if you were to ask me, and that's just something that I've noticed just from sort of being in the different communities, but if you were to ask me, I mean, the 75% guy that can do all of the things is much more beneficial. Because, I mean, there's a lot of, picking up and carrying heavy things, but it's moving loads over a long period of time. So if you have a, 1 rep max strength, it definitely will help. But if you're really focused in that area, I think you could run into problems, especially if you're deployed to Afghanistan where there's mountains.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think my bias would be toward having a team of specialists, but of course there's pros and cons, right? If you get somebody who's the 5 rep or less lifter, he might be able to, I don't know, move a boulder or something that needs to be done, but if everybody has to then jog at 70% of their ability for the next 5 miles, you might have to leave him behind, So it just seems like pros and cons there, But.
So one thing that maybe the public too wouldn't even think about is like mission dependency. What are we doing? Like, what is the mission? where are we fighting? Because that's something a lot of people don't think about. But like we do a lot of jumps into the water, and then you've got to, after you get rid of your parachute, you still got to swim to the boat, which could be up to 2 miles away in a heavy sea state at night. And so you definitely need some level of aerobic capacity. Where then, if you're deployed to Afghanistan, there's probably you're in a Humvee and you're going to hit a target. So there's way less of that.
That makes
sense. But you definitely want to be prepared for contingencies as well.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Just to bring this back to the comfort thing, this is completely serendipitous, but I was also talking with a buddy today, another professor, yesterday. Listen to the title of this study. Now, you're going to be like, duh, right? Because we were kind of looking at this, but this is the title of this study. This is from labroots.com. It was written by a science writer, right? This isn't the actual study. The study was in Cell Metabolism, but Aswini Kanaganti says, if you're willing to be a self-learner and put yourself in new situations, you will develop yourself. And then the title of this is Self-Restraint and Willpower Improves Weight Loss. Wow, right? Like, now, to be fair, they were doing different neurological scans, and they were trying to get at the mechanisms of this, right? But the title, Self-Restraint and Willpower Improves, outcomes. It's like,
yeah.
Wow, I don't know. Phil and I have joked about that in the past, something like, androgens or anabolic steroids cause muscle growth, and it's like, is that, do we need that study right now? So, I don't know. Can you maybe give some thoughts to listeners about, there's sort of a debate, I think, maybe between willpower and not even really needing willpower, maybe because you love what you do. And, you don't have to have tons of discipline because you actually love it. Does that make any sense? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's actually I've kind of gone back and forth and thought about that quite a bit because, on some level, what you're really into sort of pulls you, and it doesn't really require willpower. And so I guess it does take a certain amount of discipline, like Phil said earlier, to do the things you don't want to do. And I think that's where you can edge out performance over people that are just sort of following their passion. It's like that will get you to a point, and hopefully you found that thing that does sort of draw you in and make you want to do the work. But then on some level, it's like there's a lot of accessory work. If you're an entrepreneur, there's back-end logistics work that has to be done. All that stuff that isn't the reason you started the business or isn't the reason you're doing the sport, all of that demands discipline, in my opinion.
Right. No, that makes sense to me. I mean, some days you just, you do. If you're incredibly tired, you make that hard decision, right? Do I really need a day off here? Am I going to get sick, or is this somehow just, I don't know, a general lack of energy, and I just need to overcome this and get my ass into the gym? You know, it's one of those decisions I think we all make. What about running solo versus on a team? Are you a solo kind of guy? I mean, admittedly, I think, not to bias the answer, but I've always been like that. Like, if I'm tired, I'd rather drag myself to the gym if I have to. Usually I'm glad I did. You know what I mean? I was never a training partner kind of dude. But what are your thoughts about, running solo versus groups and this whole concept of comfort and fighting the group think, or maybe the group helps, or?
Yeah, I mean, depending on what you mean by group, but like in a lot of these strength or ultra endurance events, you have a crew, and I rely so heavily on that crew. I think I want to get into some self-supported stuff just because that's going to push me in a direction that'll be really uncomfortable for me. But yeah, I think having a crew, just because the level of discomfort, the level of pain, at least for me, is so high in these things, like really looking forward to people and having somebody to help take care of your feet and super glue your toenails back on and stuff like that is really, really good. So I'd like to say that I'm so hardcore that I don't rely on a crew, but I really do.
Yeah, I think what you're saying, I mean, when it comes to like personal injury and stuff like that, right? No man is an island, right? So that kind of stuff. Phil, hey, let me ask you, are you always the paragon saying, come on, guys, we're going to do this, do that, or do you lean on your team? Is it more reciprocal?
No, I mean, with what we got going on, I'm the one that has to, I'm pretty much the person that has to be, okay, guys, let's do this.
Okay.
And I'm also the one that calls it for them. Like you were just talking about, is this just a bad day where they need to, just step it up, or are they not recovered? Mm-hmm. So I'm usually the one that has to make that call as well. Like, no, you're done. Get out of here.
Right. Yeah.
So they kind of lean on me for that. And then, luckily, I've just been doing this long enough. I know in myself now. Like the other week, I went in and squatted 650 for 3, and the next week I came in, warmed up to 315. I was like, I'm done. I just walked out. As I knew I wasn't ready. I knew I wasn't recovered. Mm-hmm. So I have to be smart enough now myself to call my own.
Right.
And it was better for me to just walk out on that day.
It's just going to be a non-starter,
Yeah. It was going to be, I would end up just, if I pushed to where I needed to that day where I was supposed to, I'd just be hurt, most likely.
Yeah.
So
I guess it goes back to kind of Rick's point about what is the group. Because if the group are less experienced than you, I'm not sure you can give them the same level of responsibility, right, to make calls like that. Because your personal experience for years, like some of the signs and symptoms, and it can be subtle, right? Some of those intangible.
Sure. Well, and then, I mean, also, I'm a big fan of making training hard and making competition day easy. So, like in the powerlifting world, what that is like when we're taking heavy attempts in training, you're getting yourself ready. You're wrapping your own knees. You're doing this. You're doing that. And then come meet day, then you have your crew. Like when I got my meet coming up, I won't have to do anything. Everything will be done for me. I just stand up and let somebody else wrap my knees. And, that doesn't seem like much, but when you have like 58 seconds to put on a heavy set of reps and then walk over and squat 800, it makes a difference. It makes a difference when somebody else does that for you.
No, that makes sense to me for sure.
But
I feel like there's sort of a dichotomy in athletes. There's like the athlete that you have to, at least from a coach's perspective, there's the athlete you have to always hold back. That's going to like always try to max out, always going to do more. But then there's the other athlete that's like, it just seems like they're forcing it every single day. Like that was the point I got to when I was dabbling in CrossFit. You get a couple months in, I'm like, I just feel like I'm punishing myself. Like I'm not seeing the reward here. And so, everybody has something that they're specifically suited for, which is, what you kind of brought up in the beginning. It's like, you got to kind of find that passion that pulls you toward it. and then use your discipline for the important stuff. If you're maxing out your emotional bandwidth every day just to go to the gym, like maybe you need to find a new sport.
You know, that's a good call. I actually record in my training log my motivation to train on a 7 scale. And if it's normally 6, 7, 7, 6, and then all of a sudden it's 2, 2, 3, 1, I think maybe I'm overdoing it, or maybe the stress at work is lowering some threshold, you know. So I like to quantify stuff like that. I know not everybody's a numbers guy, but it's a good point, because it does. If you're I like what you're saying, like maximize your emotional bandwidth just to get your ass in there. Then something like, what's causing that? You know, there's something behind that kind of thing. But.
Yeah, I have my athletes write it down in red or circle it in red in their book if they felt like they were forcing themselves that day. And then I like it because I can flip back through their weeks and just be like, how much are we forcing here?
Right. You know, back to the point of experienced guy on the team, or a coach or a leader, you know, the whole idea, you know, I talk about adaptation and how what we do is based on it. Overload, right? The principle of overload is you have to ask the body to do more than it's used to, right? Some novel stimulus. Maybe it's more intensity, more weight on the bar. Maybe it's more duration, you know, longer time in the gym, or more frequency, days per week. I mean, but overload, that's risky business, right? That's like dose of a drug. You can overdo that. And I think you need the experienced guy to say, listen, this is the progression model, X%, you know, increase over the next couple of weeks, or that kind of thing. And I think that's where, you know, like Phil is going to be invaluable to his people, because they could over or under stimulate themselves, right, with the novelty of the new stimulus, and then they're just going to get hurt or sick or, you know, or burned out. So that's got to be touchy business. How do you go about that, Phil? How do you judge that? Is it just, do you have templates, or is it more?
Yeah, I mean, you can only run in the red for so long, you know, but I think there's times to do it, you know, and like nowadays, you know, here recently, like the squat every day has been very cliche and popular and things like that. And I think stints of that stuff is great. Stints of, you know, we're really going to push the hell out of this for a short amount of time. And we can do that and find great overcompensation out of that. It's the people that take that to a new level, like, okay, I'm going to squat every day for 4 years. And then they wonder why their hips and knees hurt.
Right.
When they're doing it heavy. So, I mean, I've just found, you know, what I found is basically we can push something like that for about 6 weeks. It's usually about 2 weeks after you're like, man, this sucks. You know, when the athletes start saying, I just don't want to squat.
Yep.
You've got about 2 more weeks, and then you better lay off. So, and then we really back off of whatever we were doing and push something else.
Yep.
You know?
Yep.
So
periodization, right? That's why it's a thing, I think. I actually, that's my same bias, about 6 weeks. I remember I went to a talk in the 90s. It was one of the early strength conditioning talks. It was over in Finland. And Phil, you and I have talked about this in the past, but like Hakkinen and some of those, you know, senior level strength conditioning guys over there. And there was a very interesting presentation. They were talking about 6 weeks to peak strength. That was kind of the idea. And he was showing all this physiologic data, like, you know, the whole Hans Selye general adaptation syndrome. You start breaking down. If you do some extended, like you're going to do a peaking cycle for 20 weeks, that's rough, bro, you know, kind of thing, at least neurologically. But Rick, how do you go about that? Like, what's your sweet spot? How novel, how intense, and for how long?
Well, you know, actually, so I was actually wanted to kind of pick y'all's brain on this, because for me, I think I've come to the point where I've realized in order for me to be able to train intuitively, I had to sort of bash up against that limit for a long time. Like I had to. And so, you know, it's sort of interesting when you talk about groups and having a coach and someone that knows for you, obviously beneficial and highly recommended. But then at the same time, I think there's a certain degree of just sort of ramming up against that neural governor, figuring out what you are capable of, what volume does to you. And then you can sort of, at least for me, now I know the signs and symptoms of, okay, I've been in the red too long. I'm going to get sick if I don't dial back. And so for me, unfortunately, I don't know that there's a good answer other than having made a lot of bad decisions.
Right.
Yeah, and that's something we've talked about a lot. I mean, there's no, you know, I know Lonnie has and I have too. We've done a lot of dumb things and learned from it. And I'm not sure there's a way around that, as far as learning goes.
You mean like
for the individual.
early career, like stupidity?
Yeah. Like early. I mean, when we first began lifting, you just go in and kill it every day. You know,
yeah. 6 days a week, bro. Yeah.
Yeah. And
yeah.
I don't know if you can. I'm not sure you can get to the same spot without going through that at some point. Now, the only way I change that with my people is I just don't start them off there. You know, we don't go from off the street to red line. You know, let's ease in for 2 months, and then let's start. Okay, let's see what you can do, and see what you can handle. And it's very, then we dose it up, and then you have to figure out the individual. Like every one of my athletes, even in the same sport. Let's take just my power lifters. I have lifters that excel on high volume, and I have other lifters that excel on low volume and high intensity.
Yeah.
So, and we can't figure that out without pushing them in those areas. So
that's sort of to Rick's point about you got to have some kind of a base.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Like take 8 weeks for God's sake. I mean, you got someone who's just a marshmallow. Build some aerobic base, build some kind of base strength, because otherwise, what are you going to redline? You're going to break the machine. You're going to blow a fan belt or something every time.
Yeah.
So
it's like, I mean, the sport that Rick's doing now, that's my wife ran ultras. So, and, we have a guy around here that came up and talked to her, and he's like, I can run 25 miles really fast, so I figured I'll just enter this 100 and I'll be fine. And she's like, oh, it's not how it works.
Right.
It's not how it works.
Yeah.
And he's tried it 5 times and failed miserably. But, you have to be smart about it too. So.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think if you're pushing it and you're redlining and you're not learning from it, well, you're just being dumb.
Yeah.
So it's like you kind of, hopefully over the period of seeing what you're capable of and sort of pushing the volume and then realizing, okay, I've got to earn this volume or I'm going to hurt myself. Like hopefully you're learning these lessons along the way. And then I think the same thing applies to diet. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of all the fad diets, but the fact that I've tried so many, I have figured out, intuitively how to eat for myself. Mm-hmm. I had to go through that, shedding the extremes and realizing okay, this isn't going to work. And maybe some people are better at learning just by reading and by being told, but I'm certainly not one of them.
Yeah. I always have a biological bias, because I always tell students everything, you're going to wrestle with these things in nutrition, biopsychosocial, but biology is always I'm a physiologist, for Christ's sake, right? So I always think along your lines is you learn a lot in yourself as far as nutrigenetics, how you respond to certain diets. Like maybe keto is just really not for you, for biological reasons, for genetic reasons. And there's performance genetics too. Like Phil was saying, some people can handle the volume and grow like weeds, and some people that will just destroy. So, and yet, by learning it in yourself, you could recognize when other people are similar or different from you. That there are truths like training principles like overload or specificity, but then there's individual differences that are undeniable as well. So I also like what you said about you have to, there's this introspection. If you don't learn from it, I feel like I need to often remind people and myself to go actually analyze my training log. Right? Because if not, I really fall into a habit of just writing down everything I do, but I'm not actually learning from it because I'm not going back over the past several months looking for those red circles that you were talking about, Rick, or my Likert numbers or that kind of thing, and then trying to piece together what destroyed me there. Why did I have such low motivation? Or why was my sleep so off? And so sometimes you almost have to make yourself do that, I think, so you can actually learn from these, naders or peaks or red lines or whatever. But
yeah, I try to force it quarterly, just as I try to run myself as if I were a business. And that's I try to do quarterly reviews and look for trends and, just figure out what am I missing right now? Especially if I'm finding that I'm hurt. It's okay, there's something going on here. Something's telling me something that I'm not picking up on.
I like that. I think biologically quarterly is really quite good. It's was it Jim, Phil? Jim Wendler, he'll talk about doing stuff for, in half a year blocks or something. People want to check their body weight every week or something. It's okay, how about every 3 or 4 months before you even take a preliminary, spot check, kind of thing. Because you can't expect some of these changes in ways the general public wants, So.
And then you're going to mix up causation and correlation for sure.
Oh,
if you're looking every week,
Yeah.
Okay, as we wind down, let me ask you this then, put you on the spot a little, Rick. What are 2 tips? So from what you've written or what you've observed yourself on teams or your own body, what are 2 tips you might give to listeners as far as beware comfort, put yourself in novel situations, anything that you'd really like to share?
Okay. Yeah. So I think the first one, I've spent obviously a lot of time like sort of figuring out how to make these or this idea approachable and applicable to somebody's life. So one of the things I think we talked about, you talked about the principle of overload. I think if you look at your life and then you look at fitness, there's a lot of things you can learn from fitness that you can apply to your life. And one of them is you can push for a certain period of time, but there needs to be a period of adaptation, a deload period, a period where you are sort of learning from all of the work that you just did. And so I think when you look at even intellectual endeavors, it's like I figured this out writing my book. You can't just push forever. There's a certain period where you need to like take a step back, adapt to what you just did, adapt to the volume. And maybe you're not adapting in the exact same way, but it's a really good way of looking at it. So it's like stress plus deload equals like a gain in whatever you're looking for, instead of just trying to add volume thinking that will produce results in the same manner. So I'd say look to ways you can do that in your life. Like I like to work in sprints where I add more and more, and then I really step back for a week and unplug and get away from the inputs. And so that's one. And then the other one is a little interesting. If you look at how flow states happen, everybody talks about flow states these days, or it's sort of in vogue, but essentially a flow state happens when you're rooted in what you understand and you're simultaneously exploring that which yet you do not understand. And so I think trying to apply that to your life is a good way to push into new frontiers. It's like, you don't want to just, like Phil said, like I can run 25 miles, so now I'm going to do 100. It's like, no, because now you just stepped way into chaos. You don't understand anything here. You went way too far. And so I think trying to stay rooted in what you understand while simultaneously exploring something new that's a little bit further away, that's how you level up. That's how you stay uncomfortable but keep it attainable. And so you have to be careful not to set your goals so small that they don't force any adaptation or any growth, but then you don't want to set them so big that you find yourself in chaos, run 105 times unsuccessfully, and it's like, well, what did you get out of that, And so for me, I would say those 2 things have been really key to understanding myself and how I grow. And then also when it comes, like I didn't just get to a 247-mile run in body armor. There were 15 ultras that started at 50K that came before that. So it seems like a really like sort of extreme thing, but there wasn't even a doubt in my mind I would get through it because of all of the work I had done leading up into that point. And so,
yeah, I like that a lot. It's very logical. Start from a base of what you're good at and what you know, and then reach into the unknown instead of just stumbling into the unknown and being shot down, kind of thing.
Yeah, the analogy I heard at one point was like when you're in a dark room in your house and you're in a lit up room in your house at night, the next room is dark. Nobody just walks straight into the dark room. You reach in with your hand, you flick the light on, you understand it, and then you step in. Nobody would just walk into a dark room like a psychopath. That's what I say to you, like with your regular life.
Makes sense. Okay, let's finish up with how can listeners find out more about you?
Sure. So Instagram is where I'm the most active, at @RickAlexander_. And then I guess if they're interested in these ideas and the things, you can go to burnyourcouch.com and it'll send you to a link to buy the book.
Wow. Okay. All right. Good stuff. Well, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. I wanted to say throughout my entire journey with strength sports, I really binge listened to IronRadio. So it was kind of an honor to come on here and talk to you guys.
Well, I appreciate that.
Been through them all.
All right, everyone. We're going to let you go until next week. So we'll talk to you then.
All right, have a good one.
Thanks, guys.
Yep.
Hey listeners, have you seen the store at ironradio.org? There are 3 halls in the store. One for Phil, one for Fortress, and one for myself, Dr. Lowry, and they're thematic. So you can go into our Halls of Iron store and choose based on your goal. If you need something to learn or read or something nutritional, you can look in my store, Lonnie's store. If you want something about injury prevention or competition, then take a look at Phil's Hall of Iron. And if you want something about motivation or daily training, Fortress's Hall has what you're looking for. There are some fun, heroic descriptors as you browse through the stores. We try to make it a little more fun than the average boring online store. And whether you're a novice lifter or someone more experienced, you can take heart that you're not wasting your time. The things that we put in each Hall of Iron are actually based on our own recommendations. Protein powders that we know to be good, knee sleeves, wraps of some kind, things that Fortress uses in his own training. The stuff you see, you know is good. This way you don't waste time. So check out the Iron Radio store at ironradio.org and let us know what you think on the forums, and certainly you can request products and we will screen them before they go in. So thanks for listening. Iron Radio is accepting donations. If you like what we do, the professors, the scientists, the bodybuilding show promoters, the athletes themselves in powerlifting and bodybuilding, please consider making a donation or maybe buying something from the ironradio.org store. We also are accepting supporting members. So for $4 a month, which is frankly less than the bank sneaks out of your account in fees, you can step up and support a form of sort of public radio for the bodybuilding and powerlifting and strength community. The Iron Radio podcast and all of the audio on ironradio.org is for informational purposes only. If you're interested in starting a diet or exercise program, it's important to check with your physician. Also seek the help of registered dietitians, athletic trainers, and qualified exercise physiologists in order to make the progress that you need.